thank you so much for joining us. We are doing this as a bit of a rerun. So for those of you who managed to join us at the London Transport Museum last month, welcome back. You obviously loved it enough to come twice. And for those of you who weren't able to make it, but potentially were interested in the content, hopefully we can deliver a similar session today. These sessions are all about you and the things that you're interested in. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question in advance. We will be trying to get through them all. If you didn't manage to submit a question as part of your event sign up, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat within Microsoft Teams. We'll be publishing the ones that are kind of PG, and the panel will be getting to them. It's a real pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Starting off with Saepio, Alan Jenkins, who is our principal CISO, so running our virtual CISO function. Been at Saepio, how long, Alan? You can put your fingers up. 1 year, 2 years?
8 months.
Feels a lot longer than that. Almost part of the furniture. Joining us. He'll be giving us a kind of rough overview of the threat landscape from a Saepio perspective, and then following him, John, Raj, and David will be giving a view from their perspective. So John, a sales engineering director at CrowdStrike for Northern Europe. I hope I got that right. You've got the longest title.
Perfect.
Good. Raj Samani, chief scientist at Rapid7, and that is a disservice. There is a lot of wisdom and a lot of things that he gets involved in, which I'm sure he will take us through. And then David Lomax, head of security engineering director of security engineering for Abnormal Security. It's much harder to memorize these when you're not looking at them. And they'll be taking us through a view from their perspective, including some of the research, obviously, that these fairly prestigious vendors are doing on a constant basis. So please feel free to settle in. Just as a reminder for those that have that have only just joined us, please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions as we go through. But starting us off, Alan, interested to hear your thoughts and if it's changed at all since our in-person session.
Thank you. Just trying to make sure I get the sharing right. Have I got that right? So taking a look into 2025, delved in from my crystal ball, and of course crystal balls are never perfect, and I'm definitely taking a broad and shallow view, hoping that the other three will go a little deeper from their respective perspectives. So that's my task with going first. We clearly have to look at what the threat actors are up to. They always get to choose the when, where, and how. And of course, depending upon where they're coming from, whether it's the nation state perspective or the organized crime or the script kiddie term, if I can still use that. It's a slightly archaic term, but it fits to some extent because they all use different tools, techniques, and processes. And I'll try hard not to lapse into the jargon here, but TTPs are key, because we use those for indicators of compromise and attribution. And of course, that gets to be important from an insurance point of view, given that Lloyd's 2 years ago, Lloyd's of London, that is, took a view that a nation state attack fell into the category, otherwise an exclusion around general war. And that's where cyber insurance has a do not go point. So there are limitations that come from the attribution piece. But I guess what's really changed is around, we have talked for some years now around advanced persistent threats. But the time window from breach to exploitation is definitely reduced. And that's presenting a challenge for clients. It's moved from something of the order of 180 odd days between breach and detection, because the attackers have been finding their way around the network to get to what it is they're interested in, to certainly those from a ransomware perspective, because detection and indeed resilience has improved in a lot of cases, they go flash to bang much quicker. And that can be in the order of, well, certainly days, if not hours. And that's where we get a challenge on our response. And if you do want to do your own research in terms of what the threat actors are up to, who they are and how they operate, There's a good database run by MITRE with a link here. I'm sure we can share it afterwards. But it's always worth thinking about motivation, because for most of them, it's about money. For some of them, it's about reputation, but for most of them, it's around money. It's getting to that point where they can extract money with menaces. That's clearly the motivation for ransomware group. It's definitely the motivation for data exfiltration and publishing on the dark web, albeit that tends to be at the higher end of the spectrum. Nothing particularly new on that one. We're likely to see more of it. What we're continuing to see, and I know David from Abnormal in particular will emphasize this, still seeing a lot of business email compromise, still seeing a lot of credential theft, and to some extent the worst threat from a client perspective is around the authorized insider, either doing something wrong accidentally or occasionally doing something wrong deliberately. And that last is really difficult to detect and contain. Obviously, in the news this year in particular, we've seen the rise of AI, both generative and true AI. It's with us. I guess a looming threat is going to be around deep fakes and particularly around media files. We're starting to see that, and that will probably feed into the email compromise and social engineering side of things. What is now, I think, on the near horizon, by which I mean up to 5 years, is around quantum computing and what that will do to our established encryption mechanism. That will drive some wholesale change in the technology space, and it's no longer on the 10 plus years. I think it's on the five or less horizon. We can probably get into that in the questions. But I think the thought I want to leave you with are, it's not just about IT. It's also around your operational technology, your industrial control systems, loosely labeled the Internet of Things. And of course, it's not just your business. Have a think about your third-party risk, your supply chain clearly, but equally risk can come to you from customers, particularly if you're exchanging information, receiving information from your customers and doing something with it. And I think I'll probably leave it there for the moment, Joe. And hand on, I think it's on to Raj next. Raj, you're up.
I put a bunch of sheep on the slide, and you're probably thinking, what is he talking about? Well, I think this picture kind of defines how cybersecurity has changed and evolved. It used to be very simple. I started my career really in the kind of antivirus world, and it used to be, cybersecurity used to be simple, because what used to happen was threat actors would try to break into organizations using malicious code. We would call them malware or viruses or Trojans, depending on what the specific configurations were. And your job was to identify the malicious code in amongst all of the various different code that's going on inside an environment. And I think part of the reason we were successful as an industry was we had a very good intelligence capability where we could actually create a signature to be able to identify what we knew to be malicious and what we knew. And equally, we would implement, the kind of reverse of that, where if we knew something was good, we would obviously create a signature for that as well. And then, of course, what began to change, and, really over the last kind of 5 to 7 years, was threat actors started to get cleverer and smarter. And we use the word sophistication really with tongue kind of firmly planted in cheek, because it wasn't really that sophisticated. Because what they began to do, and specifically, I know Alan kind of touched on ransomware, but ransomware is a really good example of where we've seen that innovation, is what they've begun to do, and specifically the affiliates. And so, not the people that develop the code, but the ones actually breaking into your organizations, is they started to use your tools against you. So in other words, you had an issue whereby, and people will always say cybersecurity is about finding the needle in the haystack. The needle in the haystack's easy because you just use a metal detector. The challenge then became, how do I find the piece of hay in the haystack? And the same thing applies to a SOC, a security operations center that's having to deal with hundreds of thousands of alerts coming inside an environment. If you know what you're looking for, it's quite easy to be able to spot. But if you have, I don't know, let's say 100,000 events of VNC inside your environment, How do you know the 3 of them that are being used by a threat group in order to be able to, work through that kill chain? And that's what cybersecurity is today. Cybersecurity is less about the known knowns, but more about these kind of known unknowns, more about trying to identify the malicious, implementation of a dual use tool and a tool you use inside your network, as opposed to the use of that tool for benign purposes. And so as we start thinking about the threat landscape, we start considering this construct of sophistication from threat actors. It's, yes, there is always this O-Day, yes, there is always this critical vulnerability, but by and large, the issue that you're really looking for is trying to kind of find out, in amongst this sea of noise and events and alerts, which 3 of those are the ones that look and smell benign, but actually are not. And the ultimate challenge you have is, how do you disrupt that kill chain quicker and faster than you've ever done before? Alan kind of touched upon this earlier, but from initial entry vector, in other words, when criminals get inside your network, to final stage payload, in other words, when they, for ransomware, for example, exfiltrate data, i.e. steal data, or encrypt, file and print, file servers. How can you do that faster? Because if you're not quick enough, it doesn't really matter, because the data's already gone or the data's already encrypted. So disrupting that kill chain, in some cases in as little as hours, is now going to be the challenge for all of us. And using code that, quite frankly, or using systems and applications that you use in your environment every single day. This is cybersecurity in 2024 and 2025 and probably beyond.
Really interesting, Raj. Thank you. I'll just pause very quickly. I had a question in the chat that made it seem like people couldn't see the slides. Could we just get a raise of hands if you couldn't see a slide there, while potentially John gets his slides up, as if you couldn't see. Okay, quite a few. Or a sheet slide. If you saw some sheep. Okay. Apologies if you're having difficulty seeing that. Touch wood, everyone can see this. The joys of technology. Cool, we got some thumbs up. Okay, thank you. Over to you, John.
Actually, if I was off mute, Joe, you can see my slide okay?
Yeah, I can.
Perfect. Okay, good. And look, this was a little bit unrehearsed, and it was kind of interesting what Raj has just kind of stated over the last 5 minutes. A lot of similarities, which is great, right? Because we're all thinking and we're all analysing the same patterns. Every year, CrowdStrike released something called what we call the GTR internally, or the Global Threat Report. It's about February of each year. And I thought what would be interesting here is to look at the trends of the data over the last couple of years, so we can also almost predict where this is going forward into 2025. So this is a free download from crowdstrike.com. We need your email address, and we'll probably spam the hell out of you after you've downloaded it. But it's a really interesting kind of bedtime read for anyone who is that way inclined. I'll go back 5 years. I'll go back actually 6 years actually to 2018. And Raj touched on this a few moments ago in terms of speed. 9 hours 42 minutes was a number that we registered, which is the average breakout time in 2018 for adversaries. And breakout time, and you're kind of using some of Raj's language there, the time it takes for an adversary to land in your infrastructure and then move laterally within your infrastructure. What's alarming is how much that's accelerated in such an incredibly short space of time. If we fast forward to just last year's data, this has dropped down to 1 hour and 2 minutes. Why is this important? Is because this means you don't have a particularly big window of opportunity. First of all, to identify a threat, to action that threat, and then remediate any threat within your organization. Do I expect this in 2025 to drop down to under 1 hour? I think probably the answer is yes. is the use of AI kind of going to accelerate that to 1 hour? Honestly, the answer is I don't know, but probably. What I can tell you though is that dramatic reduction in the last 6 years from 9 hours and 42 minutes to just 62 minutes has been largely down to the use of compromised credentials. And compromised credentials come, from many, kind of different formats and many different techniques from the adversary's perspective, whether that's password spraying, whether that's credential stuffing, whether that's social engineering, whether that's phishing. Actually, what we're seeing and what I will continue to predict going forward is that there's a real access broker boom out on the dark web right now. For anyone who's not familiar with access brokers, this is where you can buy either individual credentials or bulk credentials. You can also buy 2FA tokens. In an eBay-esque type environment, you'll bid on a set of credentials for a relatively cheap price, $180, $200 type dollars, depending on kind of who those credentials belong to. That price will increase. 80% of breaches last year, so 4 out of 5 breaches started with compromised credentials. And I think we'll continue to see this trend moving forward. We saw actually an access broker last year selling a credential database with 25 billion credentials. And if you think about that logically, there's 9 billion people on the planet. There's nearly 3 times more credentials than there are people on the planet. So we know that identity has been, a growing problem over the last 5 years. I fully anticipate that identity will be the #1 tactic that's used by adversaries to gain access quickly into your infrastructure. Raj also touched on, 5 years ago, we had a malware problem and we'd throw the best antivirus tooling out there to deal with that malware problem. And we typically did a pretty good job of dealing with that. The adversaries have grown wise to this, they've grown smart. And as Raj said, they start to use your own tooling against you. And we call this malware-free access. This is living off the lands. These are keyboard warriors. These are now real people who are sat on the end of the keyboard trying to gain access and impact within your environment. And if we look at that malware-free access, just back in 2019, I think 40% of initial access was through using your tooling with malware-free. Last year, that moved up to 75%. What this means is you can have the best antivirus solution out there on the planet today. This will have no impact whatsoever on this initial access that we're seeing. I believe in 2025, we'll see this accelerate towards 80, towards 90% type region as adversaries are becoming very clever. They're using sophisticated techniques now to create impact within your organization. And we know kind of, I just touched on a few seconds ago, identity being kind of the #1 challenge for organizations today. 80% of breaches, like I say, last year through compromised credentials. Most organizations will sit there and go, okay, John, because I've got multi-factor authentication, and I'll probably give you a story a little bit later on, but one of the favorite kind of tactics and techniques used by adversaries is something called MFA fatigue. And this is where I send you enough push notifications to your phone, to the Duo kind of MFA app that you have on your phone, or other MFAs are available as well. You'll just get bored of the prompt coming up. You either press tick to accept, or either through frustration, or you press it by accident, unfortunately. And this is a standard technique and a very common technique used by adversaries. Also, cloud has become a little bit of the Wild West for adversary activity. 60% of clouds are just misconfigured. That's low-hanging fruit from the bad guys' perspective. We saw 110% uptick in cloud-conscious adversaries last year. And when I say cloud conscious, these are adversaries who are actively targeting cloud infrastructure. They haven't landed on premise and then pivoted to your cloud infrastructure by accident. They're actively targeting Azure and GCP and AWS and other cloud environments. And then as Raj touched on is, if you've got all of this noise within your environment, I think one of our biggest challenges next year is that data disparity kind of problem. You've got lots of data coming in Right? How do you know what to do with that data? We know we only have an hour and 2 minutes with which to action. And by the way, the quickest time last year in terms of breakout time was 2 minutes, 7 seconds. So this very small window of opportunity, a huge amount of data. How do we make sure that we bubble up what's really important and what we need to prioritize within our organization to make the right decisions and make sure that we don't, that we can prevent the breach? Alan, I'll pass back to you.
We're going to Dave.
Oh, Dave,
Hello,
sorry.
Max.
Perfect. Thank you.
Catch me out there, aren't you?
Just keep on your toes, Alan.
Okay, come on, load. Does it say loading for everyone else, or is it me?
It does, yeah. That's us as well.
There we go. Cool.
There we go.
Everything you see on that one. Yeah, so I think, you know, the trends that we're seeing out there, really, there's sort of threefold things we're seeing in there, and I'm going to go into this relatively quickly, but you know, we know for one, right? 91% Deloitte said this a while back now. The cyber attacks start with some sort of phishing attack, right? You know, I think Raj said at the start, right? The days of people, and it still happens, everyone, they're still attacking you, but they'd much rather log on. It's much easier to log on and get a credential than actually try and get through an exploit, some sort of CVE they can use. A lot of these things sound very good on paper, but you know, when you looked at Heartbleed and things like that, you know, in a lab you could do these things, but not always that easy to do. Getting someone's credentials and logging into their environment, much easier. You know, I think about things like the MGM Grand Casino one, right? They got in, got some credentials, phoned in to get a password changed, and eventually shut down their entire EC2 instance of e-gaming, right? So we know this is where it's starting. And if you look at that, phishing attacks alone are getting, you know, bigger and bigger every year. You know, and it's getting worse, right? You know, the idea of the old Nigerian prince email, you know, that's what we all used to joke about, but that is not what we're seeing nowadays, right? You know, and the reason for that, a lot of it is what they have the ability to use now, right? You know, I've just picked a few random tools here, but they're becoming more and more sophisticated. A lot of the times it's a combination of all these things, right? Often we were told, look for misspelt words, look for things like that of where they were coming in. You know, they started using Grammarly to make sure it was very good English that it was being sent out for. They're now starting to use things like LinkedIn and other social network sites to find out about it, right? You know, it's always often amazing the amount of the fake, I've just joined your company and want to change my payroll emails that go around. Very easy for them to go on LinkedIn, find the company, find the person who's in charge of payroll and finance, find someone who's just joined the organization, send an email in from a random Gmail address, because nowadays who has their name at gmail.com anymore, right? We've all got very random email addresses. So, you know, they're very much socially engineering these things. And then in the middle, right, ChatGPT's come along and can do many of those things. Like we internally built a tool that allowed us just to go off and find information about people using ChatGPT, right? We were targeting an individual in our organization. It found out that he talked at this event on LinkedIn. He was writing a white paper on this. So we build a very credible email going, hey, Tim, you're a thought leader in this area, right? So we'd really like you to give your impact on this white paper. Here's a link, right? Everything sounds very credible. So when these emails come in now, a lot of the time they're very socially engineered, right? They look really good. They are going to pretend to be from Microsoft, from DocuSign, one of the ones here, right? They're always going to try and look like it's coming from your organization. You know, the big one that came along, QR codes, right? They suddenly realized that people that were doing URL rewrites or link crawling, if it was a bad link, they could find it and it made them ineffective. So they started throwing QR codes in there because people are used to using those now, right? You know, it always makes me shudder, and I'm sure all of you in the security world are the same when you see you pay for your car parking and there's a QR code and things like that. And I'm always trying to pick to see, is there more than one QR code stuck over this, right? You know, these things are very interesting. You know, we're starting to see them being used quite a lot. I was actually at an event where it was someone had put up a sign with a QR code saying, click on here to get into the portal for this event that was going on. And it actually managed to spin up their own SSID. The QR code had a link that made them automatically join this SSID, and a splash page came up, all in the right details. Put your credentials in, we'll log you in, right? Very cleverly done. You know, we've even seen the DocuSigns one now, right? These always used to have links in there, and now they've even started embedding QR codes at the bottom of it to try and evade. And on the far right hand side, right, this is genuinely a phishing attempt written by ChatGPT or generative AI, right? You know, one of the other events we ran with Saepio, I actually put a few together and got people to ask, you know, was this ChatGPT or was this human made? I'd say it was probably 50-50, but there was only 3 examples, so I can't really give you a good number on that. But the slide there really shows you, right, while they can use these generative AI platforms to build emails, right now we're not seeing a huge amount of it, but it's also relatively easy to reverse engineer that, right? So what we've done here on the one on the right, you can see is the green is what typically generative AI would use if they were building this email. The yellows are maybe, and the red is probably not. So you can see how much input they had to have on this is just those red things, right? All the rest of this is built by generative AI. So there are still tools to fight against that. But absolutely, you know, the socially engineered attacks to do that log on to get into your event, into your environment, massively the way of doing things. You know, we were promised for ages, just use 2-factor authentication. That'll solve all these problems. A lot of these phishing now are using adversary in the middle type attacks. So it's going through a reverse proxy, let's say in Cloudflare or somewhere else like that. It's even going to have a capture sign that makes you tick to say you're a human, right? These are all going to bamboozle your URL crawling or sandboxing tools because they can't do any of that. And when you actually go to log in, your phone will work, your 2-factor will work, and they'll not only be able to harvest your credentials, but also the session token, right? So if your conditional access in M365 or Google Workspace allows them to have access for 30 days, that's how long they're in your environment for. So yeah, these are really evolving. I imagine this will get worse over time with the generative AI. They will get better and quicker. But yeah, socially engineering is certainly a big uptick. And like I said, phishing is massively on the increase. Back to you, I believe, Joe.
Thanks, Dave. It's I'm going to weave it in with one of the first questions that we actually had pre-submitted here, because I would certainly ratify. We've seen an enormous amount of abuse of genuine tools, but also things like like Cloudflare captures to try and kill off. And one of the questions which I thought was really interesting is, do we think that the use of, well, I'm going to kind of bastardize it a little bit and weave it in there because I've got a kind of question on that. Do you think that a lot of this is that attackers now have access to things that are simple and therefore the kind of bar has been brought down almost, or do we think that they're having to use these because genuinely the bar has increased and businesses have gotten more resilient, which has forced attackers to use these tools? I've got my opinion on it, but I don't know. Have you got
I think
on that?
If you think in the phishing world, we are seeing generative AI being used, not very much, right? The oh woe, the world is ending philosophy. We're not seeing that, right? It's not being done in anger like that right now. I'm sure it's coming, and the harsh reality is they don't need to. It's easy enough to do what they're doing now by quickly socially engineering or building these very credible type attacks, like using DocuSign, PayPal, things like that. You can do those at speed very quickly with very little automation, right? But also, the criminal underworld, there's phishing as a service, right? There's things like caffeine and these other tools out there where you can go out and say, I want to target Saepio and I'm going to go after Joe. And it'll go and do it for you, right? So saying it's easy, I think is not true. In fact, I think for a lot of these companies, using the generative tools is harder. They have a skill set shortage just like everyone else, right? Not everyone is fully versed in how to run ChatGPT APIs and all the rest of it. So I think it's coming. I think it will get used more. So yeah, you need to be careful of it, but it's certainly not a simple way to do things. It can be a useful tool.
Sure.
Anyone that's used Copilot would know that.
Yeah. And I guess opening up to the rest of the panel, on that view, do we think that attackers are becoming smarter because we're getting better, or do you think it's that they're kind of riding the wave of technology the same way that we are as defenders?
And I'll pick that up, Jed. Look, and we've kind of tracked a couple of kind of e-crime actors, Indrik Spider and Scatter Spider in particular. I think Raj, you mentioned the MGM attack like last year. Look, now outside of MGM, we've seen a lot of activity, whether using ChatGPT to do basic things like navigate Azure, because from our perspective, our perception is they don't have the skill set to do that. Why do they need to skill up in that when you can ask ChatGPT a simple question? We've seen it with things like enter IDs, ask ChatGPT to create a PowerShell script for them. So actually what it's doing is, I think it's actually dumbing down the adversary. They don't necessarily need some of the skills and the capability that they've had in years gone by. But also what they're really doing here on with the use of AI is accelerating their time to impact. Kind of the longer the shorter their dwell time is, the longer the shorter they can go undetected and create that impact, whether that's to kind of drop malware or to exfiltrate data. That will change on a case by case basis. But my view is actually they're using AI as a mechanism to substitute some of their skills gap shortage, should we say?
Raj, any thoughts?
I mean, I will take the opposite view actually on everything that's been said. I think they have got better. Threat actors have definitely got better. Just over 12 months ago, the most common way to get inside an organization to start a ransomware attack was to target an OpenRDP port and type in a password that you acquired for about $5. That was widely known as the most common entry vector for ransomware. And now, based upon we did an assessment of about 8,000 ransomware attacks, and 30% of those attacks were exploiting vulnerabilities. Over 40% was MFA, incidentally. And you think to yourself, well, hang on, these are threat groups that were like typing in password to open systems and are now exploiting ODAs. And so what has happened is we've paid them, right? Like there's no other way to dress this up. You say, oh, our maturity has increased, maybe, but what we've done as a society is we have paid hundreds of millions of dollars to criminals who are hell bent on extorting money from businesses like the ones that are on this webinar, to hospitals, to schools, to government institutions. And we paid them, and we said, oh well, at least the problem's gone away now. I've got the decryption key. But guess what? By paying them, you've enabled them to go out to the open market and buy zero-day vulnerabilities that nobody else knew about, which made them get better. So, unfortunately, this is the world that we are now in. And again, they're now more successful because they've got more tools. The question about the use of adversarial machine learning, just to kind of reiterate what Dave said, yeah, it's not as, it's not as kind of it's not in use as maybe as much as we expect it, but it is happening. There are certainly at least one APT group that we know are using LLMs to do reconnaissance against military targets across, where their victims are. So it is happening. And quite frankly, it's happening because we are paying them money and they are reinvesting that. Like if you remember we did the research on the Winter Olympic Games, you saw the use of steganography being used as part of the initial phishing campaigns. This is the rapid tool adoption through us funding criminal enterprises to go out and target organizations.
So what's the long-term solution for that? Obviously not paying ransoms, which is is simple, but does that need to happen at a legislative level? Obviously the king, the kind of king's, some of the resilience legislation that was there in the King's Speech, do we think that went far enough?
No.
Or not? No,
not at all. You're not going to legislate your way out of a cybersecurity problem. Like, here's the thing: cybercrime will always exist. Crime will always exist, right? What we're seeing the evolution of crime. In 2013, the FBI said there are less bank robberies, but guess what? There are more digital, attacks on organizations digitally. So this is the evolution of crime. If you don't want ransomware, stop paying. But guess what? We are going to pay. And there was a recent, apparently inferred that, one organization had just paid 25 million. Well, you paid them 25 million. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to do more. So how are we going to begin to address this? Well, as an industry, we launched like No More Ransom. We started to go after threat actors. We started to provide decryption keys. That meant that they had to change and evolve. How we begin to address these issues, and I think I kind of touched this earlier, is it is imperative, and I know like Shake's got a question for John, so I don't want to take the answer, but like it's kind of touching upon that. Being able to disrupt the kill chain earlier, being smarter and faster in terms of leveraging intelligence in order to be able to disrupt these campaigns, and fundamentally through the use of things like automation, which I know is like a buzzword, but like curated intelligence will be absolutely crucial in order for us to be able to do that as an industry. So like there are ways and means around it, but like you said, like if we're going to continue to pay them, and then next year jump on another webinar and go, oh, the world's terrible, why did that happen? Well, do you know what? We paid them. So like, what did you think was going to happen?
Yeah, it's really true.
There's a reason the government decided never to pay for people being kidnapped, right? It didn't help.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting one. The other thing that we talked about in our in-person session, and we've just had a question come through, that I've published, it's around product security, and that ultimately this is a software security, a kind of software security issue a lot of the time. In terms of the good news or views on the benefits that we're seeing, particularly with security at an application level, hopefully getting kind of getting better. What's the panel's view on the rewards that we might see by software being built to better standards, which in turn reduces the number of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations which can be taken advantage of? Because I absolutely agree with you, Lionel. We don't I think as industry we get into a habit of talking about the stuff that's going wrong and not the stuff that's that's going well. But yeah, any views on that? Maybe stay with you, Raj, given that obviously Rapid7 do quite a lot in the application development world.
And Lionel, like, those are the challenges that all of us face. Like all of us produce products and, all of us implement, secure coding practices, but like there's always the possibility that insecure code will come out. And it's hard for us to be able to prove the value of something before it actually happens. It kind of makes us feel like insurance salesmen, like, oh, we should do this just in case this happens. But I think like you only need to take a look at, recent cases. So like, this morning, this morning, we published an advisory on the FortiGuard issue, which is, the exploitation of a vulnerability of the FortiGuard appliances, which are being exploited by APT groups. You look at the exploitation of the likes of Ivanti devices or the likes of the Cisco ASA devices. Like the consequences of not doing secure coding, or I'm not suggesting they didn't do secure coding, but the consequence of your software being used for mass exploitation, it is absolutely debilitating. And like a good example of that was, take a look at, you remember, like nobody had heard of Progress Software or Move IT like a year ago. And now we only know them for the fact, well, not we do, but many people only know them for the fact that the Clop ransomware group had identified 3 vulns and done mass exploitation. And so, it does feel like we're trying to prove just in case of, but I think there's enough use cases there's enough case studies out there which say the lack of, strong secure coding practices, the lack of a vulnerability disclosure program, the lack of a bug bounty program, look at what the impact could be in the event that our software is used for mass exploitation. And then, God forbid, we get into a world around liability, but there's been rumors and conjecture around, potential liability for vendors that may not implement that level of due diligence. And so there are potential regulatory sticks about to come as well.
Thank you. A question that we had. Of course, Alan.
Gary, if I may, sorry, to your point about some good news. I've been quite critical of the police prosecution side of the house, not doing enough to disrupt and deter. But actually, I think in the last 12 months, they've got back to where they were in the noughties. We had a bad period, I think, through the teens where the international cross-border collaboration was not as effective. And we seem to have had an increase in effectiveness on that cross-border thing in the last 12 months. I'm not sure it's I'm not sure it's enough to say that they are preventing, but I definitely think they've improved their detection and improved their disruption activities, even leading to successful prosecutions. And I'd certainly like to see more and that trend continue.
Yeah, agreed. We've seen the people like the NCA start to get involved fairly heavily with some of the early warning work that they're doing as well.
Yeah, and the Dutch with the breakup of the encrypted phone traffic for the networking. Yeah, that's really disruptive activity against the crime gangs.
Sure. I'm going to ask there's two questions coming for you, John, so get prepared. But one question that we had about six times in the submissions, which again everyone might have an opinion on, was around some of the recommendations in the new in the new NIST guidelines for NIST 863 for around passwords. Any views on that? The one that really people were interested in is advising against mandatory password resets on a time basis. Obviously, maybe potentially controversial. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Is that a good move, a bad move, practical?
Yeah, I would say it's controversial. I don't see the kind of the logic in that. And look, in my previous employment, this was kind of an area of speciality. In terms of we were trying to deliver a passwordless capability. And we know that many individuals will synchronize their passwords, so we have a consistent password. It makes it easy, you don't forget it. From this point of view, I guess what's the benefit? The benefit is to the user, because you're more likely to remember a password that you've had for the last 3 years. It probably helps the help desk a little bit as well, in that you're not phoning them every 5 minutes because you're in a lockout situation. I would expect that most organizations would have some form of MFA to kind of complement that password. So if I have your password, whilst kind of MFA is great, we've established over the last 20 minutes or so, it's not the silver bullet, but kind of FIDO, kind of is helping there. These FIDO keys that we now have kind of available and at our disposal, makes it even more difficult for the adversary to kind of bypass that traditional kind of MFA technique that they've been using over the last couple of years. So do I agree in not changing password? I would say I don't agree with that personally. I don't really kind of understand the benefit aside from the user not forgetting. So I'm not entirely sure what their logic was around that. So that would be my view.
Any contrarian opinions, gents?
Oh, look, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, if NCSC changed their password policy, I think it was back in 2018, moving to 3 words, and I think that was a good direction of travel towards something that's easier to remember, but actually gets away from the dictionary attack. That's got to be a good thing. And the clear direction of travel, to John's point, is definitely towards passwordless. I think one of the benefits of our interregnum 2020, 2021 was the increased rollout of MFA, but that's not a silver bullet. So things have improved, but clearly there is still a divergence between NCSC in the UK and NIST in the US, and I don't think that's helpful.
Understood.
Yeah, I think MFA is a silver bullet, but not every threat's a werewolf. Right. So in other words, like, what it's 2024 and we're just talking about passwords. Like, come on, like we've got to move on from this. Use 2-factor, use multi-factor. I mean, every single person on this call can point to, everyone knows about have I been pwned. Everyone knows that passwords are being used, compromised, shared, traded. Like, we've got to move on from this. Like, for us, like as cybersecurity professionals, we can't be sitting here going, well, yeah, maybe use these like, don't. Just stop using passwords. Let's use the multi-factor authentication or passwordless. Like, FIDO said, hey, maybe there's some applications we don't need passwords for. Like, let's do that now. Like, we can't talk about it anymore.
Big view. John, I'm going to challenge you. There's 2 questions in the chat for you. I'm happy to read them out, but maybe you can blend these into 2.
Let me have a go. Let me
2
just
questions into a single answer.
Scroll.
and then I'll
Can you provide insights on the most?
and then
Wow.
I'll
Yeah, I
get
can
back
spend
to-
the next five hours on question one. Look, it's very difficult. We track 234 different adversaries. These range from nation state to e-crime to hacktivist activity. We'll see specific activity against a particular vertical. We'll see a variance of that activity against a vertical in a particular geographical region. So there isn't a great deal of consistency. But the one thing I would say, and I probably sound like a little bit like a stuck record. Probably the one common theme is identity, and the use of compromised credentials to quickly gain access and create impact across the globe. And also, if you look at kind of MITRE framework and you look at things like persistence in there, we see some incredible tradecraft from Scattered Spider. Talked about the MGM, kind of hack just over a year ago. Look, and I was on the receiving end of that, having been in Vegas, kind of just 24 hours later. But starting to drop trusted identity providers as part of their tradecraft, having gained access into their infrastructure. Using compromised credentials, drop a trusted identity provider into that environment. So therefore, when that account is blocked, or whatever mechanism you're trying to do to kick that attacker out, they can go back and use their own identity provider to gain access into that environment. I mean, what was really interesting, and anyone who was at our Vegas event a couple of weeks back in September, a really interesting shift in tradecraft, and particularly out of a North Korean nation state actor that we're tracking, is we've seen a huge amount of activity in false job applications out of North Korea, using kind of Zoom calls, implying that they are US based citizens in country, got fake ID. We have recordings of these Zoom calls. They're using kind of deep fake activity to mask their actual image. If you look on the FBI website, there are 4 individuals they're specifically looking for. One of those is highlighted on the FBI website. We highlighted the other 3. Why do they do this? Is they want to onboard, kind of into an organization. They typically have laptop farms that you're kind of RDP into. What's their end goal is effectively to retrieve credit card information, to take money, and alarmingly, what they're doing with that money is actually to fund the North Korean kind of arms regime there. So really, it's super wide, super diverse kind of threat that we have across the globe right now. Is a common theme. Common theme is identity. Probably the other one is cloud. In terms of that obsession with cloud infrastructure. And I think finally it says in here, do we guarantee? Look, yeah, we do guarantee. Look, there's no software alone in this world which will provide you 100% protection. And here at CrowdStrike, look, we believe in our technology, but we also believe in the human element of our team and our services team, our intelligence team, and a combination of those 2 technologies and services combined will provide customers with an assurance on what we call a breach prevention warranty. So if you've got all the right modules and all the right services from us, we'll provide a guarantee that you will not be breached.
I guess that's addressing the second part of the question.
Yeah, that was the second part of that question.
Thank you.
Go on.
The other question, which I thought was really interesting and has come up a few times, so multiple questions asking, are around some of the development of things like Purview and tools within Google and Microsoft that allow revocation of access rights either to documents or emails, and the general kind of consensus that there are obviously enormous benefits of being able to revoke access rights for the sender. But how do we think this is going to impact the rights of, either from an audit perspective or from a compliance perspective, for both parties to have access to a piece of material, an email, a document? And does that change how things are being done and have kind of knock-on impacts from a data protection perspective? Quite a big question. and would open it up to anyone that wants to have a crack at that. After everyone's mulled it over, it's quite a deep implication one.
Yeah.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because like you're making the inference that organizations have good, strong data governance in order to be able to, number one, classify their data, then implement the controls and measures almost on a, hopefully not on a per document basis, but also like on a classification basis. I don't know of many organizations that have that level of governance really, with regards to the data they have and the data that they own. Like it's information governance is the heartbeat and the foundation of good security, but it's probably the most difficult job to do, and it's probably the dullest job to do as well. Like if we're being honest with ourselves, I mean, like I think the only, like even on my own devices, like I couldn't tell you the amount of data I've got, like just on my local drives. When I had 100 meg hard drive, yeah, I could pretty much tell you everything that I had, but like the ubiquity of data and storage means that we have data everything and everywhere all of the time, constantly out there. So I agree with you. I think that's the nirvana, but I think I don't know how I don't think anyone's doing it. Like, I mean, maybe some government institutions are, but like even with them, everyone's suffering from a deluge of data and information.
Yeah. Alan, any thoughts?
I can only agree with Raj. I think, Joe, you and I see it with our client base. They're struggling. Even the concept of data classification is beyond some of them. So we're still tackling a low level of maturity to get them into the place where they can tackle it. I think we've still got to try and get to simpler solution space, and I don't think we're there yet. But that's not a very good answer. Apologies.
But Alan, like you've done this before, right? Like I think we used to work together. You remember, like you'd roll out things like DLP, and you'd put in force motion on that, and all of a sudden, like the business stops working.
Oh yeah.
Nobody had any idea, or like Dave, you'll put like block domain X coming in for like phishing domains, and all of a sudden you realize you've broken something, that the way the business works. Like it should be simple, but like data and the dependencies and like you reuse within like it's just like this really like this enormous bowl of spaghetti that you've got to like try to unravel, and it is and that bowl or the content's just increasing and increasing and increasing. So like I agree with you. I think, Joe, like you're right, like that's the way that we should do this, but it's not easy. It's not easy. I'm not going to say it's impossible, because nothing's impossible. It just takes longer, but it's hard.
I do wonder whether some of the developments, particularly by Microsoft and Google, actually are making things tougher for people. If I think about a scenario, a client sends to a law firm a purview protected message that that they have to receive in a portal. They can't take they can't download it or take a copy of that of that message, and it doesn't get stored in their email archive like it might if it was an email. Is that message, do they have a system of record for that message? Are they falling out of compliance because they can't keep a copy of that, because whoever sent it to them can revoke access at any time through purview? And does that create a bit of a loop? I don't know. Anyway, maybe I'm a bit existential about Microsoft and Google here, but I think I can sympathize with one of the challenges there.
Yeah, but like people find a way around those controls. Like I'll just take a screenshot. Like, is that famous story? Do you remember, like, NASA? Apparently this is true, but apparently NASA spent millions and millions on like developing, a pen that can be, you can use in space, and the Russians just used a pencil, right? Like it's like human beings, like you can put all of the investment around technology that you want, and you can put the controls and everything else as well. And like we've had that, right? Like you'll have documents coming in with like You can't download it. You can't. But people find a screenshot, and if you can't take a screenshot, they'll take a photo. You know, like there are ways and means around this, and so I think like it's not a technology discussion. It's not a technology answer. It is a people and process answer, and
Got you.
getting them to understand the importance of it is key. I mean, I used to be a CISO, and like the number of times people would circumvent security because it didn't help them, that there was too much friction. I think that's the challenge, is how can you put security to have with lower friction is probably the key.
Cool. If whoever asked that, because I can't unfortunately see who asked the question, but if whoever's who asked that question is in the chat, feel free to expand on your concern there. A really interesting question was, what are the questions that nobody is asking, of their security provider? What are the questions that people should be asking of, vendors, partners, that they aren't asking that they should be? Another existential one.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Really picking easy ones there.
And I'm happy to go here, guys. I mean, the question that you should all be asking is, where is my biggest risk? Where is my biggest exposure? Where's my biggest threat coming from? And those of you who saw me at the Saepio event at the Transport Museum a couple of months back, I used my Gladiator, which is actually released today, Gladiator 2, I think, isn't it? So it's very topical from that perspective. But in the first one, Maximus gets into Rome, and he gets to the Colosseum. He's told to choose a weapon, and he walks to the top of the slope, and he says, "Whatever comes out of those doors." And you think, oh wow, he has no idea there are lions and tigers on the other side of that door. But if you did know there were lions and tigers before you chose your weapon, maybe you'd have chosen a slightly more effective weapon against something with sharp claws and sharp teeth. And no different in this world. If you don't understand what's coming your way, and what the adversary's motivations are, and what their tradecraft is to kind of create impact within an organization, it's very difficult for you to provide a level of protection for your organization against those specific threats. So I guess the number one question I would be asking to any security vendor is going, like, where is that threat coming from? Who is it coming from, and what tactics and techniques are they likely to use when they arrive at my doorstep?
John, forgive me for being contrary. I think that the challenge with that, and by the way, I subscribe to it, know your enemy, but it's on the client side of it, you've got to be able to do something with that information, and not all of them can. Right, so to Joe's question, what are people not asking? The one that I saw, and to some extent this is a little while ago, but I think it's still valid, is what have you done to secure the back end of the tool or service that I'm buying from you, to make sure it's not presenting additional risk to my enterprise when I add it to my armory? Because particularly in startups and scale-ups, the concentration on getting to minimum viable product, getting your early clients on board with some functionality, securing the back end is not the first priority. And I don't see enough clients asking for assurance in the SMB space. I see it at the enterprise level. We're seeing more interest in third-party risk management, but not enough lower down in the client space.
How, I shouldn't really get overly involved in it. From a panel perspective, how should SMBs be trying to fix that issue? Which I see a lot, and I hear it. I certainly hear as a complaint from from a lot of SMBs, where they ask the question but then don't get the answers because they're only 25 people, and therefore their contract value is £2,000, and therefore nobody at that vendor is interested in giving them an answer and kind of overview it. Is that just a reality of business? I don't think a lot of it of the time it's a lack of trying. I think a lot of them just simply don't get acknowledged.
Yeah, and that's a good pushback as well, Joe. I think that's to some extent, I think we're as a actually there's a role for Saepio here in terms of encouraging the vendors to have that assurance statement early, to not wait. There's definitely a role for standards here. I get frustrated by the fact that UK government pushes Cyber Essentials on to end-using clients, but hasn't yet required it of MSPs who are supporting many of those SMBs. That I think is an area where that would be getting close to silver bullet. The effect of that degree of, I suppose you could call it, regulatory control onto the service providers would help many more. But standards themselves are not the whole answer, but I think they take us to a better place.
Yeah, one of the things that I not to answer my own question, but one of the things that I'm seeing quite a lot of, and I imagine probably all three of the the vendors on here are the use of things like trust centers, which essentially give all of that information up front to to anybody that that's authorized. Again, apologies, John and Raj, I haven't seen yours specifically, but I know that Abnormal have a very good trust center with all the information, all the real-time stats, all the certs, and I wonder whether that will help move it along. So yeah, interesting. And
Joe, I think maybe one of the questions, like, here's the question I think people need to ask is to, like, look beyond the hype, right? So, like, what I mean by that is, you'll go to InfoSec, and depending on the year you go, every vendor will spout out the same taglines as everyone else. I think for the last 2 years, it's next generation. I think that was a period. Then it was AI. Then it was threat intelligence. Like, there's always these buzzwords that go up and go about, and you've got to scratch beneath the surface of that. So, like, if somebody starts talking about, oh, we're next gen AI, okay, well, what models do you use? Like, how do you actually train your models? What's the efficacy of what you do? Companies that sit down and say, well, we have like real-time threat detection. Well, how long did it take for you to be able to put content development for this particular 0 day? Like, how long did it take? Ask that question, because if your vendor's taking 72 hours to put a detection in place for a critical vulnerability, it's too late. And so, like, just scratch beneath the surface of the kind of top line buzzwords, and I think kind of go and get them to prove it. Like, that's the key part. Like, don't believe in them architecture. Like, show them, like, ask them to show it. Like, how long did it take you to get coverage for example, this latest Fortinet bug, for example?
It's a really good point. One thing that I suspect some would ask is, I don't know what questions to ask. We've got lots of customers who, an IT manager or an IT director that that would be, self-admitting that then that they're not an expert in some of these things. How do they know what questions to ask? One of them is, I would say, ask your partner. We will, often have a fairly good idea of, some of those things. But I mean, any other resources that you can think of, Raj, that that are a good way for people to educate themselves on how to kind of unpick and scratch off that, that kind of top layer of lacquer?
I mean, this sounds terrible, but like
Google.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Fair
like,
enough.
I mean, there's a lot of buzz, and I use the word buzzwords, but like, security is not really that hard, right? You have a vulnerability. This particular organization will be able to provide a solution that will help you manage that particular vulnerability. That's all it really simply is, right? And so if you're going out to buy something like a vulnerability management solution, to scan your network, then the question comes to, oh, okay, well, of all of these particular vulnerabilities that are known to be exploited in the wild, what's your coverage against those? Like, I think yesterday, CISO released the top 15 vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild. How long did it take for you to be able to get coverage against those particular vulnerabilities? Oh, okay. What is the false positive? In other words, how many times do you write content that's not actually accurate? Other questions that I would probably ask would be, oh, tell me what additional content you do in order to be able to educate me on your process with regards to identifying these, and what's the SLA with regards to getting content out. Like, you know, these SLAs are going to be crucial, right? Because the vulnerabilities are going up. And so, like, I think for me, those are the types, because security is not a commodity. Like, you're not just going to go out and buy, you know, if you buy software from a company that claims to have great AI, you don't actually know that they've got great AI. You need to ask those qualifying questions, which is, what is the SLA? How long does it take? What's the response I would expect to get if I raise a support question? You know, like day-to-day operations. It's like buying a car. You know, the same sort of questions you would expect to answer, like when you're buying any product. Cybersecurity is not any different. It shouldn't be any different.
Really helpful. Alan's put some potential questions to ask in the chat. Thank you. That was that was very interesting. Got two different questions, both asking the same thing, which are, I will play into your hand fairly well, David. You're gonna have to make an argument here, but mixing up the language of the two different questions essentially are asking, there seems to be a trend in email of some vendors saying that we should be using banners and trying to coach users into kind of taking the right actions, and then another half of the market who are saying if an email was malicious, it shouldn't be sat in the inbox. We should be more ruthless, and just take the action away from the user. Obviously the NTSC have some of their opinions on we should be supporting users by giving them as much technical support as possible to stop as many emails go into the box as possible, because they're only human. I know I've certainly got an opinion on that, but and obviously I know how Abnormal does this, but what's your kind of argument and and some of the reasons why you think Abnormal have taken the direction that you have?
Yeah, a few people have asked me similar questions before, and I think if you look at any of the automation we've been promised for a long time with security orchestration, full stop, right? Was you can automate all these things, we're going to detect things, we're going to automate them. Most of us that have been in any sort of SOC world or work with any SOC teams know that they don't trust the detection, because most of it's coming from a SIM. That's like pouring sand on top of sand, and they're like, well, I can't take an action until a human decides whether this is good or bad. So it comes down to the source of the truth, right? Is the detection high enough in efficacy that means I can automate that process? Training is not a bad thing. I and we as Abnormal have never said stop training people, right? You should absolutely do that. If you look across all the phishing simulation companies out there, though, worldwide, your company may be different. Still about 24% of people click the link, no matter how well you've trained them, right? So we are training them incredibly well. And if you think about what we were doing 5-10 years ago compared to what we're doing now, it's amazing. But these people are accountants, they're marketing people, they're not cybersecurity experts. Flip side of that is there's 100% emails I've seen, and I've done this for over 25 years, that I would have gone, yeah, that looks okay. And it's not until I really dive into it that I go, no, it's just very, very effective. So one of the big changes has been, if you look at the legacy way of doing things, the SEG way of doing things, if you want to call it that, was an MTA, it was a mail transport agent. Email comes along, pick it off the conveyor belt, look for known bad. And the problem with the known bad approach is exactly why CrowdStrike now exists, right? Signatures didn't work. Downloading a DAT file every day was great if you wanted to know about car accidents that happened yesterday, right? It's not 0-day stuff. CrowdStrike, like us, don't care what it is. We care what it does. And that's a very big difference, right? Behavioral data science has really helped us do that. What's important about this, and you speak to any data scientist, though, is I can build you a fantastic model if you give me a lot of well-structured, well-labeled data. In the SEG world and the traditional way of doing things, you don't get that, right? You have one email in isolation. I don't know if I talk to that vendor normally. I don't know if I normally talk to that individual, right? There's no relationship information whatsoever. It's typically going to look for bad links, bad IPs, bad senders, that kind of stuff. Now we're all moved and or have moved and are moving to M365 or Google Workspace. The data's there, right? Every email you've sent, every email you've received, every email you sent internally, all your sign-in events, all your mail filter rules you've created, right? You look at some of the traditional SEGs out there, and they'll tell you about the 1,000 signals they're looking at. Typically in Abnormal, we're looking between 40 and 90,000 signals, right? That's how you get an accurate efficacy detection. Everyone wants to automate. But and typically the vendors that are telling you, you need to banner, you need to do this, you need to do that, is because their false positive rate is so high, it would be a SOC burden to be able to do these things, right? So, that's the big thing, right? You can do it one way. You can absolutely do it and go, well, we're on the fence here, so we're going to label it, we're going to tell you to make the decision. But you still fundamentally get that problem. The user or someone has to make that decision, right? We would much rather it be, we have enough data to be very convinced this is a bad thing and just remove it, right? Some of our customers are at like 600,000 mailboxes, and they regularly say if they spend more than 15 minutes a week in our platform, it's unusual, right? So, the Holy Grail is automating those things, right? There may be, and there are examples where you're highly regulated and you go, look, I can't afford that 1 in 2 million mistake. I need to go through. In that case, you have rules and you go, right, I will banner this one because I've only got a select number of users that are going to always get emails no matter what, but they are going to be very well educated to know that this is giving you a very strong warning. You shouldn't be clicking on it. So, my view is you absolutely want to automate this and you want to do it at speed. If you look at the stats I did at the start, right, this is only going to get worse. There are more and more and more of these things coming out. And as we all said, right, with the rise of generative AI, they're going to get much better.
Thanks, Dave. Really interesting insight. Question that is going to be controversial because half the panel might work for what you would call a platformized vendor. The question is quite straightforward. I can never say this right. Is platformatization in the security market a good or bad thing for customers? And just for for anyone that that is not kind of familiar with this this term, essentially vendors that offer quite a few areas of tooling in a single in a single platform. It's quite it's been quite an interesting thing. We've seen a lot of merger and acquisition activity from some people on the panel, but also in industry. I'll open it up to the floor. Is maybe a question, a slightly more accessible way to the question would be, why are vendors creating platform-based solutions, rather than staying as individual? And I guess what are the arguments for? And maybe John and Raj, given that you are, what I would consider more of a kind of platform set of vendors, and then yeah.
And I'll take the historical approach, kind of pre-platform, if you like. I talk to a lot of customers on a monthly basis and on a quarterly basis, and they've typically gone out, they've made specific investments in security tooling to address, and I think Raj touched on this, like you have a particular problem, you go talk to a vendor, that vendor solves that problem, you make an investment in that, and that becomes part of your security stack. So whether that's kind of an antivirus solution, whether it's a DLP solution, whether it's a threat intelligence, whether it's a SIM, whatever that investment is, you go out and typically these customers buy best of breed technology for each of those challenges that they have. The one thing I've learned in my 3 years at CrowdStrike is adversaries, they're not quarterly driven, they don't get a monthly bonus for doing a number of breaches in a certain amount of time frame. If anyone wants to look me up on LinkedIn, one of my previous employers, they were hit by an Iranian adversary. That adversary sat on their infrastructure for 6 whole months, undetected. Actually, the FBI notified them. I'd left the organization at this point. I got a really nice letter to say, sorry, John, we've lost all your personal data, but we hope you're doing well, and please pop in for a coffee. So we know they're patient, and I think the challenge with when we take individual point solutions to address specific challenges, the patience that these adversaries have, they'll look for gaps, right? They'll figure where you don't have the synergy between each of the products that you have, and where they find a gap, that's typically where they're going to go and create kind of most impact within the organizations. I think the other challenge with point solutions, and probably one of the drivers for for that, and I can't remember the word you use there, Joe, but to platformatize this, if you like, is do you have the right skills? Do you have the right capability? Do you have kind of enough resources within your SOC team to be able to manage those tools, to be able to maintain those tools, to be able to optimize those tools. I think too many organizations make these investments and they sit in their SOC center and they wait for something to flash red or an alarm to go off, and believing that investment is, in that best of breed technology is good enough. And unfortunately, the adversary is slipping between the gaps, and I think that's probably kind of one of the key drivers for taking a platform approach, is to try to bring everything under a single agent, if you like. Too many agents on endpoints create overhead in terms of memory, in terms of CPU, in terms of incompatibility, creating kind of false positives on themselves, because none of the vendors kind of are trusting each other. So I think it simplifies it from a customer experience to bring under a single agent, to bring in a single console, a single pane of glass, to have complete visibility of all of those tools bundled into a single platform is probably the takeaway that I've had over the last couple of years here at CrowdStrike.
I think, Joe, it's worth pointing out. I think if you go back, and most of us here are old enough to remember when McAfee, Symantec, and those kind of guys, they were the big, what as we would call them then. They weren't really a platform. They were portfolio vendors, right? They sold lots of things. I think the world has changed dramatically, and how a platform means it's sensible adjacent technology, right? You are covering a broader spectrum in your wheelhouse. You're not doing a big red, big yellow, or big blue and say, well, we've got AV over here. Hey, let's buy a web application firewall. That makes sense. And put those all together. And you end up with a lot of companies that did it through acquisition, where you've got the core product you went for was fantastic. And because you wanted to have that one throat to choke, you then put up with a substandard web application firewall, right? You didn't go for the best in breed. I don't think, certainly with Rapid7 and CrowdStrike and people like that, the platforms they're providing are in absolutely parallel adjacent technologies, right? It's where you want them to expand into. They're not going off into weird and wonderfuls. We all would tell everyone for years that a UTM firewall was not as good as the best in breed next gen firewall. But for SMBs, having a reasonable firewall and an average everything else was okay. That's what they did. So I think the world has changed dramatically from then, right? I think these platforms are to address a broader spectrum of problems, but still staying within the swim lanes of those organizations.
Raj, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I want to kind of double down on what John was saying earlier. Let's take a look at really how modern attacks work. The way that the modern attack works is you will get an adversary that will start off with reconnaissance, typically. Then they will come out and then they will try to do initial trying to break into the environment. Then they will establish a beachhead, do lateral movement, escalate privileges, and then effectively go to final stage payload. And that modus operandi means that there are multiple points in which you could potentially identify and detect that somebody is either going to target you, has targeted you, has broken into your environment, moving inside your network, escalating privileges, or deploying exfiltrating data, or doing whatever they want to do. And typically, if you approach this in a siloed mentality where you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to go out and buy the best threat intelligence that I possibly can. But if it's not integrated and connected with all of the other various components in your security stack, then there's no way for you to be able to piece that together. And fundamentally, being able to command your attack surface means your ability to be able to take disparate sources of information, correlate that information, contextualize the various different events, enrich that, and then actually provide you with, actionable intelligence that you can then go out and do something with. We don't have the luxury of, fire and forget security anymore. We don't have the luxury of, dealing with a million events every single day and going, well, I'm just going to go through those through our SOC and then try and figure out what's going on. You can't do that. And so I think the platform play, and maybe there's another terminology for it, but kind of having that comprehensive view about what's happening is necessary, because that is the way that criminals are successful today. And so it's necessary because it has to be necessary.
I mean, I would agree, and again, not part of the panel, but certainly I think we've seen from a Saepio perspective, particularly organizations that are offering, kind of ultimately manage security services or MDR services by expanding, the tool set that they can leverage expands, the outcomes that that customers can get from that service, which I think is a positive thing. So yeah, really interesting insight. Very quick follow up from the question earlier around some of these challenges with Google and Microsoft built, potentially putting challenges on our way. Raj, the only feedback was that unfortunately a screenshot won't hold up in court, and as a law firm, it's somewhere that we spend a lot of time. So again, interesting challenge. I think a part of that would be asking them not to send that type of message, especially if it's if it's a client or or a firm that you're working with, saying that that you won't accept that. But yeah, difficult. I don't know whether Alan, I guess from your time sat with Saepio customers, any final thoughts on that kind of conundrum of not being able to take a piece of information as and have it as part of the record?
It's certainly worrying some of them. Some of our clients are certainly worrying around that. I think most are still struggling, even with our help, around affording what they need. And I think somebody's made a comment here around 10,000 versus 100,000. Does it buy you 10 times as much effectiveness? I think there's still a disparity between bang for your buck, between what an enterprise can get at the millions space versus the 10,000 space lower down, and that I think is a challenge across the board. But we're working on that, and I know you and the sales team work to get the best prices we can, and clearly our 3 vendor partners here are in the cost-effective space. But it's still a challenge for a lot of our customers.
Understood. Just a gentle reminder: if any questions that you put in the Q&A will be anonymous, but we've still got some of the pre-submitted ones to go through. Again, back to AI. One of the industry's biggest pain points at the moment is AI, and privacy regulation around this is quite fuzzy. Has anyone on the panel personally come across any scenarios where threat actors have made use of AI in some shape or form, or seen an organization that has seamlessly integrated AI into their workflows across DevSec, HR, Ops, whilst also adhering to privacy laws and regulations?
I mean,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Well, actually, I was just going to say, like, all of us have here, right? From like the use of machine learning for security efficacy amongst the InfoSec industry is not new. Like, we've been doing this for a while. Like, I think for most of us, we've just been going, all this hype around AI and machine learning, but like, yeah, we know, we've been doing it for a while now. Like, and part of the discussion that we've been having is, we knew that, like, obviously signature detection was limited. We knew heuristics was limited. Now the use of machine learning, so like, yeah, we've all been doing it for a while. So I don't know what took everyone else so long. Sorry.
John, did you have something you want to say?
No, I mean, I kind of compound that. I mean, CrowdStrike have been doing this since day one. What we've realized is, like, there's a skill shortage, out there. We don't have infinite resources on within the SOC team. We know that breakout time is, kind of rapidly decelerating year on year. How can we be more effective within, kind of within our environment? I mean, all the detections and behavioral capabilities that we've looked at, kind of in the past are still there and will continue to evolve. But actually, from the front end, how can we help the SOC operators be more effective and navigate around an environment quicker? And for the tier 1 guys, like asking a simple question to the environment and getting a very quick answer, all the way through to kind of create me a query into the SIM that will go out and pull me kind of all of these events out, something that would typically take hours or possibly days. we can now do in seconds, and some of those reports that you need to take back to the board that can take you a week to generate, we can now generate with AI now in kind of in seconds rather than weeks. So I think that there's benefit from the protection side. I've already mentioned, from the bad guys' perspective, we've seen a lot of activity using AI in a malicious way. But equally, it's been protecting, kind of our customers here at CrowdStrike for the last 11 years, and we continue to evolve that from the front end to accelerate the time to mean time to remediation for our customers as well.
Thanks. An interesting one here again. How do I convince the board that investing in an active security culture is going to provide us a better protection than achieving compliance certifications?
It's always a hard one.
Yeah,
it's never a problem until you get owned, right? And when you get owned, it's not good enough. I think that the risk level is very important, right? I think one of those things, you look at a lot of the compliance things, they're always, you set the bar here and go as long as you can show that you've done to this level. But if you're an organization that the potential harm of losing that is much higher, then it's your mileage may vary on every different organization, I think, for that.
I'd also be interested to know what type of business you're in, out of interest, because actually I think a lot of the drive that we see, especially in mature organizations now, around achieving certifications are because clients that might be buying software are asking for those standards, and therefore actually they're enabler of business. So difficult one, but sometimes there's commercial levers behind those needing to achieve things like SOC 2 or FedRAMP and other things. But any other views from the panel?
Yeah, you don't own the risk. Go on, John. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, sorry.
Go on.
No, not at all. Yeah, No, I should say, look, from CrowdStrike perspective, it's difficult. I mentioned before, you make these investments, you believe you have a level of capability, and maybe that belief is somewhat overestimated. We know there's a lack of resources out there and capability and skill set from a security angle, and look, we recognize that. We provide a breach prevention warranty for our customers to say that we'll manage this for you, we'll do everything for you, and with our technology and our services, you can go to the board and say, CrowdStrike will say they'll guarantee that they'll stop the breach, and if they don't stop the breach, we're going to get our money back effectively and more. So I think there's ways and means to take this to the board, but believing you can do this with technology alone is you're building your foundations on sand.
Yeah, I was going to provide a slightly different perspective. Like you're, within InfoSec, you don't own the risk. Like, you have to remember that. Like, you're not, ultimately you might be the one looking for a job, but like, you don't own that risk. And so, it is up to the senior leadership and the executive leadership of the organization you work in to accept whether a risk is something they're willing to tolerate. And look, I used to be a CISO, so the way that I'd approached it had been, it was up to me to basically to articulate what the risk is, put forward a recommendation and a proposal as to how I suggest we reduce that risk to a level that should be tolerable to the business. But ultimately, if the answer was no, then I would ask this, I think the Cabinet Office, it was the Cabinet Office's data handling requirements, had this concept of senior information risk owners. So then I would go to the senior information risk owner and say, well, okay, I've recommended for us to be able to put these controls in. Effectively, the business is saying, no, they can't do that. Therefore, I need you to recognize and acknowledge the fact that you accept that risk. And if the CIRO was unwilling to accept that risk, then you would have to document that at the very least. But like, typically speaking, it is a business decision. It is a business decision. So what you need to do is effectively be that consultant, provide the guidance, the advice. But if the business wants to go ahead and accept something which you feel shouldn't be accepted, then you need to get them to accept that risk, because in the event that risk becomes realized, then you don't want to be the one that is, held responsible for that. And I know that seems like a little bit of a cop out, but that's just the reality of risk management. Like the security department should not own the risk for the business.
Fair point. We're coming to the end of the questions, so I'd say if anything that anyone said has kind of prompted a question, please do put it into the Q&A, because I think it looks like we're coming to the end. One of the last questions is
Joe. Sorry,
yes.
I just realised there was a question from Jamie earlier. I'm not sure I've
sorry, did I miss that?
That one. Well, I think we were trying to kind of answer two with one, but I'm not sure. So Jamie was asking,
sure,
basically, do we liaise with the bad guys to pay the ransom? Look, we have a dedicated services team. We do a number of incident responses for customers around the globe, almost on a weekly basis. Look, our advice to customers on day one, and by the way, any of you can call CrowdStrike. If you have an issue, you can put a call into us. It's a no obligation, it's a no cost call. But the immediate advice that we will give is don't pay the ransom. And secondly, you don't go and re-image your environment to try and kind of unwind from the situation that you're in. We need to understand how that breach has happened, and we can only do that with kind of forensic activity. But I'm not aware, Jamie, I know you put this in here, that you said in an InfoSec event that we'll act as a middleman. I'm not aware that we've ever said that. Not to say that we haven't. I'm certainly not aware of that. And I think, kind of going to Raj's point, if you're going to pay ransomware, you'll continue to exacerbate the problem even further. Look, I know we have contact with adversaries around the globe. We have dedicated teams that go out and try and infiltrate these groups and befriend these groups to understand what their tactics and techniques are. We know Scattered Spider, which we believe were a Eastern European adversary. When we were looking at the MGM hack last year, we actually ended up on a phone call with them. I won't go into the detail of it, but there was an American accent on the end of that phone call, a deep South American accent. But I'm not aware of us actually liaising. And in fact, the one thing we do say and recommend is, don't pay the breach, and secondly, don't re-image to get yourself out the situation, because that doesn't solve anything. That doesn't tell us how this happened in the first place. And if you re-image, probably 24 hours later, you're going to be having the same problem again. So I hope that answers the question, Jamie.
Thank you. The question, so yes, one of the last questions had no more in the Q&A. So maybe the last question is, how should businesses be attracting cybersecurity talent besides money? Or is money the answer of all?
Well, not all SOC people and cybersecurity talent are coin operated, right? That is definitely not the case, and I can say that because I've got a lot of people I'm hiring right now as well, right? They're not all that way, but I think if you can automate and remove the mundane tasks, they'll want to stay, right? Often the problem isn't necessarily getting people; it's keeping them. If they sit there all day looking at false positive reports and trying to pick things out, they won't stay for very long. So, I think finding them, I genuinely think, is getting better. It seems to be there's some really good talent out there nowadays. Yes, they're going to demand a premium now because there's still a shortage of them. But I think the more you can do to automate the mundane, so what they're doing is interesting and exciting, which is what turns most of them on anyway, you'll keep them longer.
Yeah, and I'd back that up, David. I mean, there's a lot of automation and kind of store capabilities out there on the market today. The number of false positives that kind of customers see when you start chasing your own tail becomes very tedious very quickly. I would suspect job satisfaction kind of declines very, very rapidly when you're doing the same thing over and over again, or becomes like a factory job. But there is a skill shortage. I think threat hunting is an incredibly interesting space, and something that certainly any graduates that we take on board, become incredibly interested in kind of, very quickly. They're using their brain, they're using their imagination, that they're upskilling all the time. And I feel if people are learning and there's an opportunity to learn kind of going forward, you're going to have a pretty engaged employee.
I'm going to answer this slightly differently. Don't believe, we've been led to believe that there's no talent out there and we can't find the people we want to do the job. That's nonsense. Genuinely speaking, I've got 3 people that I am personally mentoring, fairly new into the industry, who I'm trying to find jobs for, right? Like, in fact, one person I actually met at Chipotle. Like, genuinely, I took the kids for lunch, and I started talking to the lady that was serving me. She said, I've been doing this job here, but actually, I've had 6 months cybersecurity experience, got hit by redundancy, can't seem to find anything else. Please, can you help me? And I'm helping her, try and do a resume and helping her, reach out to the industry to find her something. So first and foremost, there are people out there. Now, you may have to compromise on the level of experience that you have, but that's okay, because you know what? When I started, I did 25 professional exams. I read every book you could. Learning technical skills is not hard. It can be done. The other thing that I would suggest is then, as you begin to build and develop your team, and so, yes, okay, you might have to accept the fact that they may be slightly junior. This is when you need to start to collaborate and work with your partners, whether it's the vendors that you use, whether it's the likes of Saepio, working with them. Like at Rapid7, one of the things we've been doing is threat hunting workshops, because obviously, within Rapid7 Labs, we have Velociraptor, which is an open source DFIR tool. And we've been working with our customers and providing free kind of, threat hunting workshops to show them, actually, this is how you would do threat hunting, or likewise, how you would do vulnerability prioritization, and bringing security teams along to teach them on how to do that, not necessarily putting them on very expensive training courses. And so, you're going to have to think maybe sometimes slightly out of the box, and with budgets and training budgets in shrinking, start to leverage and utilize your existing investments and go to the likes of Rapid7 or like Dave and John or Alan and others and say, hey, look, can you please help me? And can you do an EBC, for example, or can you get your researchers to do a webinar on the exploitation of this particular vulnerability? But if anyone kind of leads you to think that there is no talent out there, I'm going to go and do a talk at Manchester University at the end of the month for undergraduates and postgraduates in cybersecurity. Welcome to join me, right? And I'm sure you'll get a ton of people saying, hey, I'm looking for a job when I graduate. Please, can you help me? Welcome to come. And I was at Bletchley this week, and we used to have, there's I think 11 schools during that Bletchley that were there. The young generation of cybersecurity defenders are already walking around, the likes of Bletchley and other places. So yeah, just think out of the box.
Really good answer. Really good. Last question before we say thank you.
Joe, can I add to?
Of course.
Echo Raj's point, but think about hiring for potential rather than experience. To the point about it's easy to learn technical skills. I think it's easier to learn technical skills than it is getting the right mindset. If you've got the right mindset, the learning becomes easier. So think about that potential, particularly for the juniors or those who are crossing from a different career stream. I've been supporting Caps Lock for a number of years now, and I'm a big fan of it. And it's not about the dollar. It's we lean on security people's passion, because it's not a 9-to-5 job, and I think we all recognise that. Passion and potential, I would recommend people look out for.
Last question, quite well, I wouldn't say a cheeky one. In a single word answer, what is the most interesting vendor that each of the panelists has seen in the last 6 months that they don't have a vested interest in?
Jesus. Does that have to be in cybersecurity?
I think so. Well, no,
Okay.
no. I mean, it didn't specify.
I'm going to cheat, right? And I'm going to I'm going to cheat, right? But can I just say, and it's not a vendor, but can I say NCSC? And purely because I think their Cyber Girls First program is just mind-blowingly awesome, and I want to congratulate all of the work that's gone there. And I realize that's not the answer you were looking for, but I actually want to congratulate the work that they are doing, because we need to tell people this is an industry people can work in. So Dave, John, Alan, good luck.
Thanks, Raj. Yeah, appreciate that. I was going to say there's one thing I used to, a constant thing I would do with my colleagues if we were at InfoSec or at Gartner was if you could work for anyone else, who would it be, right? Who do you think is really cracky right now? And I'm going to give a slightly similar answer to Raj and say, I think most of the people on this call are the companies I would go and work for, right? They're the ones that are doing it. And I think that amount of companies is shrinking, right? You walk the halls nowadays, right? There are very few. There are a lot of legacy people, and we talked about portfolio companies and things like that have been around for a long time and are living off their customer base. The companies that always excite me are the ones that are really innovative and are looking at things differently. I think to Alan's point there, when you're trying to hire a top person, non-neurotypical people are normally the best. They look at things very differently to the rest of us. And I think any company that I look at and go, yeah, I like that. They're thinking different, to use the Apple term, that it's important, right? We've all done similar things for a long time, and the companies that are surviving and doing well, certainly in the economy we're in right now, are the ones that are being innovative and doing that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I back that up, David. And look, where I see a huge amount of that innovation coming out of is Israel. And we've been on a bit of an M&A trail recently, specifically with Israeli companies. So I see a huge amount of that innovation and that disruptive technology coming out of that space. I mean, we acquired Adaptive Shield. We made an announcement on that last week. Israeli company. We had Preempt before that. I think there's some super interesting small organizations out in that neck of the woods who are bringing some real innovation to the market. And if I was looking to move outside of any one of these glorious vendors on this call, I'd probably be looking in Israel's direction, because they seem to be the front runners in this space.
Throwing in a couple of the acquisitions there, John. Maybe tossing
topical.
the vested interest part of that out of the amount.
Yeah.
Alan, you want to put a punt in?
Yeah, I'm going to duck it slightly because I'm not going to name a particular vendor. I was kind of interested to see the UK government recently put 160 million into research hubs, specifically around quantum. And I think that's an interesting area to watch what comes out of it, because they'll pick up the startups, but it's the ones who survive that who get through to scale up, which I think will be worth watching and investing in potentially.
It's a perfectly roundabout answer. Thank you, Alan. Given that we've got no more questions, I think we will finish 15 minutes early and give everyone a bit of your Thursday afternoons back. An enormous thank you, in particular to John, Raj, and David for carving out time for both this event, and the event before. I think we've kind of talked through some really interesting, kind of questions across the two sessions, and and if you do have more that that you think about in the coming days, please do just ping your Saepio account manager, and we'll try and get an answer back back to you. Likewise, Alan, thank you, and for everyone for for having joined us. We hope it's been interesting, and hope to see you all again soon, either on one of these or in person. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John, Raj,
Pleasure.
David, again. Cheers.
No worries. Bye now.